was black, soft-spoken, and alone, standing in a line of luxury travelers who didn't look like him, speak like him, or think he belonged. Moments after showing his first-class ticket, a smirk from the gate agent triggered a chain of humiliation that unfolded in front of dozens of silent witnesses. He was pulled aside, questioned again, downgraded without cause, and dismissed by security as if his very presence was an inconvenience the system had no patience for. No yelling, no resistance, no raised voice. Just a quiet man being told in 100 different ways that he was not welcome in the world he had paid to enter. What no one knew, what not a single one of them bothered to ask, was who he really was, and why their casual cruelty would soon become the most expensive mistake this terminal had ever made. Stay with us. You're about to witness a reckoning, not a revenge. Tell us, in the comments, where you're watching from, what you would have done in that situation. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Malcolm Reed stepped into the bustling terminal of Grantley International just before sunrise, the light outside barely breaking through the glass panels that stretched from floor to ceiling. His steps were measured, polished shoes tapping steadily on the gleaming floor as he approached the security checkpoint. At 41, Malcolm exuded composure built from decades of navigating rooms that weren't built for him. Dressed in a dark slate gray suit with subtle blue pinstripes and a silk tie tucked beneath a wool overcoat. He greeted the TSA officer at the podium with a calm, low voice. Without a word, he gestured for Malcolm to repeat himself, lifting his hand in a vague signal to speak louder. Malcolm obliged, repeating his name clearly, though the implication in Parker's look said more than words could. There was no acknowledgement of the professionalism in Malcolm's tone, only a flat order to remove his mask and stand back. The lounge check-in desk was around the corner, glowing softly beneath the arch of a high white ceiling. Behind the counter stood Kendra Mayers, her blonde hair pulled back, her posture rigidly efficient. Malcolm handed over his boarding pass and passport, his tone still level. She took both, looked at the name, then at him. The flicker was subtle but unmistakable. She tapped at her keyboard, then hesitated. Malcolm could see the hesitation transform into something familiar. Performance. She leaned slightly to the side, speaking softly into a microphone that wasn't necessary. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard longer than required. Then she glanced up and gave a practiced smile. "Please wait a moment. There seems to be something that needs checking," she said it lightly, with a tone that almost sounded helpful, but the undertone was clear. Malcolm stood aside, watching as 3 passengers behind him, all white, handed over their passes and were welcomed inside with almost no interaction. He checked his watch. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere shifted. Soft jazz played under the hum of discreet conversation. Leather chairs lined the room like private thrones, and baristas behind polished counters served espresso with efficient charm. Malcolm found a corner seat facing the tarmac, his tablet already in hand, but he didn't open it. Instead, he sat still for a moment, absorbing the stillness. He wasn't new to these rooms. He had sat in them for years, sometimes as a client, often as a competitor, increasingly as a silent owner. The world didn't know his name, not the way it knew the companies he invested in, or the IPOs he quietly backed. He liked it that way. But this morning, the subtle rudeness from the checkpoint still lingered like a haze. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But each instance carried weight, like droplets collecting in a flood. The morning announcer echoed through the lounge, announcing pre-boarding for first class on Flight 1442 to Chicago. Malcolm stood, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, and moved toward the gate. Gate A12 was less crowded than the general boarding zones, the carpet darker, the walls lined with brushed steel. As Malcolm reached the front of the line, he presented his pass to a young man named Justin. The scan beeped once, then again. A second beep. Justin frowned, his eyes flicked to the screen, then up to Malcolm, then back down. "Just a moment," Justin said, stepping aside and pressing his earpiece. His voice lowered as he turned his back, whispering something to someone unseen. Malcolm waited, jaw set, eyes calm. A few feet away, a tall man in a navy suit watched from behind sunglasses, his badge briefly visible as he adjusted his briefcase. The badge said VP, Airport Development. Malcolm took a breath. Another delay, another recalibration. Justin returned, 2 minutes later, with a new boarding pass in hand. "There was a reassignment," he said, his voice apologetic but hollow. "You've been moved to 6C. Malcolm didn't ask why. He simply took the new ticket, nodded, and continued onto the jet bridge. Behind him, the VP in Navy walked up and handed over his pass. Justin greeted him warmly and waved him through. No second beep. Inside the aircraft, Malcolm moved through the narrow aisle to 6C, a seat still within first class, but no longer the private window seat he had selected. The man now sitting in 2A had already removed his blazer, settled with a glass of champagne, and looked up only briefly when Malcolm passed. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He returned to his phone and began typing. Malcolm placed his bag in the overhead compartment, took his seat, and opened his tablet at last. The document on screen displayed projections for a merger vote happening in 72 hours. The airline in question had been bleeding profit for 3 years. His firm had slowly acquired voting shares for the last 9 months. One paused just half a second too long before offering him a glass of sparkling water instead of the champagne served to those around him. Another made a point to confirm his seat number, despite the large printed tag above his head. Across the aisle, Mr. Whitman, a white-veiled man in a plaid blazer. Further back, Brooke Simmons, a fashion executive Malcolm recognized from trade journals, chatted freely with a crew member who hadn't even glanced at her ticket. Malcolm kept his eyes steady, offered polite thanks, and sipped the water without a word. The man in 2A caught his gaze for a moment, then quickly looked away. That glance was brief, but the message in it was clear. Malcolm didn't look like he belonged. From the front of the cabin, a shift occurred. A supervisor stepped aboard, his navy blazer marked with the airport emblem, a clipboard tucked under his arm. Eric Holt. Malcolm recognized the name, Vice Director of Terminal Operations. Holt spoke quietly with the flight attendant at the boarding door, his eyes flicking toward Malcolm more than once. Without introduction, he approached Malcolm's seat and gestured slightly, inviting him to stand. "We need to verify something with your reservation," he said, keeping his voice low but authoritative. Malcolm stood without question, his face unreadable. Holt led him off the aircraft and into the jet bridge without offering a hand, walking 3 paces ahead as if separating from liability. In the boarding corridor, Holt stopped beside a gateside workstation and motioned for Malcolm to wait. "It's just a systems check, a discrepancy in seating records, nothing more," he said. Malcolm replied evenly. "Is that discrepancy exclusive to C2A, or to passengers of a certain background?" Holt didn't respond. He looked at the monitor, tapped a few keys, then stepped away. And feet behind them, 2 agents were scanning the next wave of passengers. A couple in hiking gear passed through without pause, laughing about something on a phone. A hedge fund manager Malcolm recognized from conferences breezed past with a nod. To the attendant, "No delay, no error," Holt returned, waving off the concern with a mechanical smile. "You'll be reseated shortly. A slight internal adjustment," he said. "No apology, no explanation, no accountability." Malcolm looked toward the plane, then back at Holt. "Is the seat still available?" Holt paused, glanced at the manifest again, and shrugged. "It's occupied now. The flight must proceed." His tone was final. Malcolm knew this game well. Bureaucratic avoidance cloaked in polite indifference. A system where the issue was never the seat, but always the man sitting in it. Back on the plane, the man in 2A now reclined with a second drink, laughing at something, on his tablet. No reassignment, no scrutiny, just quiet entitlement. Holt gestured toward a new seat, still in first class, but on the edge of the curtain that separated it from business. Malcolm walked back in without speaking, brushing past the flight attendant who avoided eye contact entirely. He sat, adjusted his cuffs, and opened his tablet. The screen lit up with a draft document titled Asset Control and Terminal Equity Reallocation Proposal. He scrolled down to the summary page. A line read, "Majority shareholder, RNC Ventures, controlling stake, 62%, execution date pending CEO arrival." He tapped the screen twice, sending the file to a secure account. Behind the calm exterior, people like Holt were used to controlling roofs. They didn't realize someone else had started buying the building. The cabin began to close. Doors were locked, the air thickened with scent of leather and citrus, and engines hummed faintly in the distance. Malcolm buckled his seatbelt and glanced sideways as Brooke Simmons passed, smiling faintly in recognition. She didn't stop. A man across the aisle cleared his throat and looked away. Even in silence, the air carried message. "We don't expect you here. We don't know how to place you." His presence disrupted the unspoken social choreography they all followed. The implication wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It showed up in double checks, in the way questions were framed, in how authority hovered close but never quite admitted fault. Malcolm leaned his head against the rest, half closed, as the aircraft backed away from the gate. As the plane turned toward the runway, a quiet vibration coursed through the floor. The woman beside him, mid-30s, dressed in green, tapped out an email on her phone and didn't speak. A flight attendant appeared once more, and though her tone was friendlier this time, she asked to see his boarding pass again. Malcolm gave it to her wordlessly. She looked, nodded, and returned it without apology. The repetition wasn't about policy. It was about reinforcing uncertainty. Still, he kept his posture erect and movements precise, every gesture intentional. As the cabin settled, a flight attendant named Lauren Chase approached from the galley. Mid-40s, blonde and crisp in her uniform, she wore the expression of someone who had been doing this job too long and believed she knew everyone's story just by looking at them. She paused at Malcolm's row and glanced down at the manifest, then back at his face. Without waiting for a cue, she requested to see his ticket again. Malcolm complied silently. Her eyes narrowed. She asked for his frequent flyer number. He gave it. Then she said it calmly, professionally, as if it were a mere clarification. "This section is reserved for elite platinum members only," Malcolm responded in kind. "That's correct." But her gaze lingered, probing. She didn't move on. The implication hung between them like stale air. From the jump seat at the front of the cabin, Jake Ralston leaned sideways, whispering something to another crew member, Mia Torres. Their eyes were locked on Malcolm. Jake let out a soft laugh, the sound swallowed by the humming engines but visible in his smirk. Mia shook her head and said something under her breath. The exchange wasn't loud, but it was sharp, ugly in intent. Malcolm felt, not the words, but the weight of judgment, the dismissal coded into body language, the shared assumption that he didn't belong. Lauren, meanwhile, continued reviewing his credentials as if she were deciphering a riddle. When everything matched, Malcolm nodded once. He knew this rhythm too well. He had lived his whole life under the gaze of people who assumed that dignity was earned only when granted by them. The rest of the cabin absorbed the energy. A few passengers exchanged glances. Some looked away. Others adjusted headphones, feigning ignorance. But the air had shifted. The subtle choreography of elite travel, silent, polished, unspoken, had been disturbed by something as simple as a man refusing to shrink. Malcolm opened his tablet again, this time not to read but to take notes. His fingers moved swiftly, documenting names, locations, Lauren Chase, Jake Ralston, Mia Torres, all of it. Not out of vengeance but precision. As the plane began taxiing, Malcolm reclined slightly and closed his eyes, not to rest, but to listen. Every breath around him was part of a system, and systems had weaknesses. The soft cough of a man 2 rows up, the wine being poured on the left aisle, the false professionalism of Jake's voice as he made announcements. All of it would matter later. He would ensure it. At cruising altitude, Lauren returned with a tray of hot towels. She handed them out with efficiency, left, right, back, front, until she reached Malcolm. She paused again, then, almost as an afterthought, she offered him one last, a hesitation, a micro-dilemma, just enough to register. Malcolm accepted it without a word. On the far side of the cabin, Jake whispered again to Mia, this time louder, "Fake it till you make it, huh?" Mia chuckled but quickly quieted when she noticed Malcolm watching them. He didn't glare, he didn't flinch, he simply observed, letting the silence between them stretch like tensioned glass. For people like Jake, silence was more disarming than outrage. They expected anger, anticipated it like a trigger they could report. Malcolm gave them nothing but stillness. Hours passed. The flight drifted over the Midwest, lights flickering below like constellations trapped on the ground. Malcolm requested a glass of water. Lauren brought it without comment, her eyes not meeting his. Across the aisle, a man in a linen jacket tapped the attendant call button. He received a bourbon without asking. The small distinctions built a larger picture. Malcolm didn't ask for more. He didn't engage. He simply waited. A storm was building. not of weather but consequence. He knew the rules of this game better than anyone. He had studied them, out-Nagugered them. Now he intended to rewrite them. As he looked down at the tray, tables, his phone vibrated once. An encrypted message appeared. Confirming board briefing, stand by. He smiled faintly and locked the screen. As the plane descended into final approach, the cabin lights dimmed, casting everyone in a soft amber glow. The luxury atmosphere tried to soothe what the culture inside continued to disrupt. Jake passed by with a clipboard, checking names before landing. When he reached Malcolm's row, he paused slightly, scanning the manifest, then glanced at Malcolm and moved on without a word. No Mr. Reed, no nod, no confirmation, just movement, just erasure. The hesitation from staff, the veiled contempt in their voices, the awkward pauses when addressing only one passenger. At first, he had shrugged it off, but the tone shifted when Malcolm was asked a third time to confirm his seat despite clearly wearing a black titanium card on a lanyard around his neck. The young man, Lucas Merritt, had grown up watching his mother be dismissed in similar ways. He quietly activated the camera on his phone, tilted it slightly, and recorded the brief interaction between Lauren and Malcolm near the galley. No words were spoken beyond protocol, but the tone was clear. He titled the clip, "First Class, Still Second Class Treatment." Within 5 minutes of uploading it to a short-form platform, the algorithm picked up the video. Shares spiked. Comments surged. The plane hadn't even touched down, and outside the aircraft, the storm had already begun. Back in the cabin, Clara Jennings, seated 2 rows ahead of Malcolm, had watched everything unfold with increasing discomfort. In her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a bun and a scarf looped over her shoulder, she was neither loud nor impulsive, but she had lived long enough to recognize injustice when it arrived, wearing a uniform and a smile. As Malcolm stood to retrieve his coat before final approach, Clara raised her voice, not with aggression, but with unwavering clarity. "Are we going to pretend we haven't seen how he's been treated?" The silence in the cabin cracked. Heads turned. Jake Ralston paused mid-step. Lauren Chase stiffened near the curtain separating first class. Clara looked directly at the flight crew, her tone calm but firm. "I've flown with this airline for 30 years. I've never decided they didn't belong." The air turned colder. A few passengers nodded subtly. Others remained rigid, unsure how to react. Malcolm didn't move. He looked at Clara with quiet respect. But it was too late. The system reacted. Jake approached Clara and asked her to remain seated, citing landing protocol. She complied. But once the plane stopped taxiing and parked at Gate 14, Lauren returned with a security officer already waiting at the front of the cabin. She leaned toward Clara and, with a forced smile, told her she would be escorted off separately for interfering with flight operations. Clara stared at her, bewildered but unflinching. "You're punishing me for asking for fairness," she said. The officer didn't argue. He simply gestured politely toward the front of the aircraft. Passengers nearby began whispering. One took out a phone, another tapped out a message. Clara stood with dignity, straightened her blouse, and turned to Malcolm briefly before walking up the aisle. He nodded to her in silent gratitude. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted from passive compliance to fragile, watchful tension. By the time Malcolm stepped off the plane, terminal Wi-Fi had done its job. His phone lit up with dozens of notifications. The video posted by Lucas now had 80,000 views. A trending tag had begun climbing in the city's local feed. Another passenger had uploaded a still image of the moment Malcolm was questioned at the boarding door. The caption read, "This is what subtle discrimination looks like at 36,000 feet. Someone had already identified Lauren Chase by name through her visible ID badge. One comment thread speculated about her prior conduct. Another linked her to a closed complaint from 2 years earlier involving a Hispanic passenger and similar treatment. The algorithms were not kind, nor were they slow. Outside Gate 14, 2 uniformed staff members stood with expressions somewhere between regret and confusion. A man with a tablet operations staff, judging by the lanyard, was already being approached by 2 separate passengers. Malcolm ignored them. He walked to a quiet corner near the windows overlooking the runway and tapped out a single message. "Activate briefing. Use media queue. Priority reroute on agenda. Include today's footage. Time exact." The response came instantly. "Confirmed. Press alert queued. Holding statements ready." Legal team in transit. He slid the phone back into his coat. The game had changed. Elsewhere in the terminal, Clara sat calmly in a small office near the arrivals hall, sipping water from a paper cup. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't charged. She was simply labeled uncooperative, detained briefly and then quietly released without record. A junior officer had apologized to her on the side, but it meant little. She smiled and said she understood. What mattered more to her was that someone had recorded the moment. A woman from the same flight had posted a picture of Clara being escorted off. The image was now being shared with the caption, "She stood up, they silenced her." The post had gone viral within 40 minutes. Back on the tarmac, Lauren Chase walked briskly down the service corridor, speaking into a headset with clipped urgency. Jake Ralston followed close behind, pale and visibly shaken. The footage had reached internal teams. A manager from PR had called ahead. By the time they entered the crew office, 3 higher-level supervisors were already waiting. Jake stood near the wall, arms crossed, trying to shrink into the background. The questions had been coming in waves since the plane docked. Legal had been notified. PR was involved. PR was already writing responses before the statement drafts even cleared compliance. It was chaos, but Jake in his gut still didn't understand why. He was difficult, Jake finally muttered. He didn't fit the protocol. The supervisor glanced at him. "Protocol doesn't mean suspicion," she replied coldly. Jake's jaw tensed. "Look," he said, louder this time. "There's a pattern here, okay? People like him, they always push boundaries, always demand to be seen as something they're not. You give them an inch and they take the aisle." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was condemnation. Outside, that room, in a quiet corner of the terminal near baggage carousel 3, Malcolm stood with his coat folded over one arm, watching the city's early evening light filter through. The glass, the airport's low din buzzed around him, rolling wheels murmured instructions, and the faint hiss of hydraulics from service doors. His phone vibrated again, another link. This time, it was audio, Jake's voice, caught mid-command in the crew lounge by a sympathetic staffer who had grown uncomfortable with what she was hearing. She'd sent the clip to internal HR, and someone had leaked it. The words were crystal clear. Malcolm didn't react. He simply forwarded the audio to his legal team, attached a timestamp, and returned the device to his pocket. This wasn't about the insult itself. He had heard far worse. It was about the ecosystem that allowed it, about a system so accustomed to deciding who was valuable, it forgot the consequences of being wrong, especially with someone who owned the chessboard they thought was theirs. Just across the concourse, in gate area B6, a child asked a question. Sophie Whitman, 8 years old, held her mother's hand as they waited to board a different flight. She had watched everything, earlier. The delays, the raised voices, the man being moved again and again despite never raising his own. She had seen the woman with silver hair escorted away, and had noticed the glances. The whispers. Sophie looked up and asked plainly, "Why did they treat him like that? He didn't do anything wrong." Her mother froze. Clara Whitman, mid-30s, dressed in tailored beige, tightened her grip on her daughter's hand and gave the simplest possible response. None at all. She turned her head away and said, "Don't worry about it," then adjusted Sophie's coat as a distraction. But Sophie didn't stop thinking about it. Even as their plane boarded, even as the world resumed its indifferent rhythm, the moment lodged in her memory like a splinter, quiet but persistent. Back in the corporate wing, Malcolm walked calmly into the executive arrivals suite, where a black car waited by the curb and 2 assistants stood by with updated briefing folders. He nodded once, took the lead file, and opened it mid-stride. It contained the updated performance data for the airport's staff conduct scores, passenger satisfaction charts, and more importantly, 3 open investigations into discriminatory incidents from the past 6 months that had all been internally closed without discipline. All of them had one overlapping name, Lauren Chase. He said nothing. The car door opened, he entered, the assistant followed. As the doors shut, the driver confirmed, destination, Tribune Tower West. There, Malcolm would meet with the City Development Commission. The terminal expansion proposal was still under review. Until now. Across social media, the fire had spread further. Comments were pouring in. Major accounts had reshared the video of Malcolm's repeated Sikh verification. Others had begun connecting the airport to a long-standing pattern of subtle racially charged service failures. A journalist from a national news outlet reached out directly, requesting a formal statement. Instead of a quote, Malcolm's team sent footage, documents, and legal filings outlining infrastructure contributions made over the last 3 years by his holding group. Included was a memo confirming that 43% of the terminal's upcoming rebuild funding came directly from his firm, an investment they could withdraw without public explanation. The journalist didn't need more. The headline was already writing itself. By the time the sun dipped below the sky, painting the glass tower in honeyed light, the city knew. Phones buzzed across city offices, executives scrambled. PR divisions entered emergency mode. Lauren, now sitting in the HR director's office, watched as her own words began circulating in digital spaces beyond her control. "They always push boundaries," she had said. "They take the aisle." There was no defense that could soften that. Not now. Jake had gone quiet. He hadn't spoken again since someone from legal had asked, "Did you mean it the way it sounded?" They did not yet know the full extent of Malcolm Reed's influence, but they knew enough to recognize a threat that couldn't be dismissed. Chief Howard Reese, head of security operations for the terminal, received a direct call from the executive office upstairs. "We need this man away from the public eye until we figure out who he is," the voice instructed. Reese, said by-the-book veteran with 30 years of experience, activated protocol without protest. 2 plainclothes officers were dispatched. Their orders, respectfully but firmly, remove Malcolm from the high-visibility VIP lounge, citing operational concerns. The irony of removing the airport's largest investor from the very facility he helped fund was lost on no one, except those enforcing it. Malcolm sat quietly in the corner of the glass-paneled VIP space, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him, untouched. He was aware of the eyes that had started shifting toward him more often, the whispers just beyond the frosted partitions, the quiet steps approaching in rehearsed patterns. When Chief Reese arrived with the officers, Malcolm didn't stand. He looked up and offered a polite nod. The chief introduced himself formally and explained that, due to current unrest in the terminal, they were temporarily relocating him to a more secure location. Malcolm asked one question. "Is this a security protocol or a political reaction?" The chief hesitated but offered no direct answer. Malcolm stood, buttoned his jacket, and followed. No resistance, no spectacle, just silence, deliberate and razor-sharp. Passengers nearby watched. Some recorded, some looked away. But none of them would forget how calmly the man carried himself while being escorted like a threat. Unbeknownst to security, in a staff room tucked behind the administrative wing, a junior employee named Sasha Marino had just made a costly decision. Earlier that afternoon, she had overheard Jake Ralston laughing with Mia Torres and another male staffer about the performance Malcolm had supposedly put on. They joked about how they could spot people like him from a mile away. They reenacted the boarding incident. Sasha, disturbed but unsure what to do, had quietly activated the voice recorder on her phone. When the laughter grew louder, and one of them called Malcolm, entitled just because he wore a nice suit, she began recording video. She didn't plan to share it, only to have proof, in case the investigation became serious. But in a moment of anger, she sent the file to a friend via private message. She typed, her friend shared it once, then again. Within hours, the clip landed in the hands of a freelance journalist. The video went live at 6:14 p.m., just as Malcolm was being escorted to a restricted conference room behind the security station. The footage was raw, grainy, but unmistakable. The voices were clear. Jake laughed first, followed by Mia's Malcolm giggle. He thought being rich makes you right, just another loud voice with soft shoes. Another staffer added, "I bet he Googled how to act rich on the way in." The video ended with a fake accent mimicking Malcolm's speech pattern. The comments section exploded. Within minutes, public outrage escalated into formal pressure. Advocacy groups reshared it with captions like, "This isn't passive bias, this is active humiliation." Local news anchors picked it up by the evening broadcast. Twitter flooded with calls for accountability. By the time the PR team received the link, the view count had already crossed 6 figures. Inside the airport's private corridor, Malcolm watched the situation evolve not through panic, but precision. His phone vibrated again. This time, it was a calendar update. His emergency board briefing was approved for early morning, followed by a press conference slot confirmed at 10 o'clock. IMMS. Another message from legal read, "Public statement pending your approval." Malcolm replied with 2 words, "Hold release." Not yet. He had no intention of looking vengeful. But the silence would break soon, and when it did, he wanted every piece in place, no chaos, no outreach, only consequence. Meanwhile, within the airport's operations room, panic began to seep into the hierarchy. Sasha, called into HR, broke down immediately and admitted her role. She wasn't punished. Instead, she was quietly moved off shift and asked not to speak to press. But the story was already gone. No containment could stop it now. Multiple employees had begun to come forward with similar stories. Old complaints previously buried re-emerged. Lauren's file was requested for review. Jake's history with complaints resurfaced, unfiltered and ugly. Executives debated suspensions versus terminations. The consensus shifted quickly. This was no longer internal. Back on the concourse, a quiet rhythm returned to the evening flow, but tension simmered underneath. The public didn't yet know Malcolm's name, but they knew his silence. They saw his calm walk, his patient stillness, his refusal to be provoked. She answered on the first ring. No greetings, no pleasantries. "Go," he said. Eleanor's voice remained calm but clipped. "Press team is in position. Executives are asking if you're ready to authorize the formal reveal." Malcolm looked toward the polished glass wall and the blurred silhouettes moving beyond it. 30 minutes. Public terminal. Full media. Include all documentation. Use the title they keep ignoring. Eleanor hesitated only a second before replying. Understood. Announcement going live. Malcolm ended the call. Outside, the airport thought it was dealing with a PR nightmare. What they didn't realize was that their entire expansion depended on the man they just walked out the back door. In the operations wing 2 floors above the main terminal, chaos had taken on a suit and tie. The deputy director of infrastructure for the airport, Daniel Mercer, stared at a live stream sent to his phone by a colleague. His face drained of color as he watched a local news station cut into regular programming. With a breaking update, Malcolm Instructive's and terminal incident is Malcolm Reed, chairman and CEO of R&C Ventures, Mercer muttered. That's not possible. But the screen didn't lie. A graphic appeared, listing R&C Ventures as the lead capital investor behind the $900 million, 0-cents terminal expansion project slated for construction over the next 6 quarters. Mercer dropped into his chair and opened the investor files they'd reviewed weeks prior. There it was. Majority vote threshold belonged to R&C. The board had made it clear, if Reed withdrew, the city lost leverage, and the airport lost federal compliance match funding. He looked up just as his chief of staff entered the room, pale and breathless. "He's asking for the central concourse," she said. Mercer didn't ask why. He just nodded and stood. Below, in the heart of the terminal, Eleanor's team moved with surgical precision. A small press riser had been deployed in front of the atrium's wide staircase, flanked by velvet barriers and a neutral-toned backdrop branded discreetly with the city's seal. Airport security hesitated when they saw cameras roll in, but no one stopped the team when they flashed clearance levels normally reserved for contractors and legal auditors. Malcolm appeared at the far end of the terminal floor exactly at 5:55 p.m. He walked calmly, not flanked by attorneys or shielded by bodyguards, but by 2 R&C public affairs directors in tailored suits and grim expressions. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply stepped into place, adjusted his cufflinks and looked directly into the crowd of reporters now gathering. With growing confusion, across the terminal, a large digital screen had been updated to show his name, photograph, and title. Beneath it read a message, statement from the infrastructure partner of the Terminal Redevelopment Initiative. The first reporter called out, "Mr. Reed, were you detained?" Another asked, "Do you plan to pull funding from this project?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He waited for the room to settle, for the eyes and lenses to find him. Then, slowly, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a slim black folder. Inside were printed pages marked with board approvals, grant guarantees, and conditional funding clauses. All signed, all enforceable. He handed them to the lead press liaison, who began distributing them without delay. "This airport," Malcolm said, "sits on capital it does not own. It survives on relationships it does not respect. And today, it showed the public who it still thinks belongs. A hush fell over the space. His voice was steady, almost detached. I'm not here to grandstand. I'm here to confirm that the man your employees escorted, questioned and humiliated, holds voting control over the funding for every square foot this expansion touches. Inside the executive suite above, Daniel Mercer and 3 other administrators stood in silence as the live feed continued. One of them finally said, "That's the man I walked past at the city review hearing." Another added, "We thought he was legal counsel." The realization rippled through them with brutal clarity. They had built an entire public infrastructure plan around someone they had never bothered to recognize. Worse, they had insulted him at every turn. Mercer turned to the communications director. "We need to issue a response immediately. Acknowledge the mistake." The woman shook her head. "We passed that line an hour ago." On screen, Malcolm continued, "I've chosen not to make this personal, but let me be clear. What happened today reflects a system." Cameras clicked in rapid-fire bursts. Every sentence was now its own headline. Malcolm concluded his address without raising his voice or calling for boycotts. He didn't need to. The weight of his words came not from fury, but from fact. There will be a review. Not just of personnel, but of process. Not just of bias, but of blindness. And I will oversee it myself. He turned and walked away, but by finality. Outside, the sky turned dark. Planes landed and departed overhead, unaware that the ground beneath them had shifted. A full-screen image of Malcolm Reed, composed and sharp in a navy suit, flanked by a clean banner reading, "Primary Financial Architect, Terminal Redevelopment Initiative." Beneath the title, bullet points detailed project funding, infrastructure milestones, and the percentage of federal matching funds his firm had unlocked. Around the terminal, passengers stopped mid-sentence. A father, pulling a suitcase with his toddler, slowed to a halt. A barista at the cafe leaned over the counter. Everyone saw it. For a moment, there was no flight, no gate, no boarding call. Inside the airport's control hub, the impact was immediate. Emails burst into inboxes with subject lines like, "U Argent, Public Damage Control, and Priority 1, CO identified." Meeting rooms filled, department heads panicked, and in the center of it all, Nancy Cole, Director of Terminal Operations, paced in measured panic. She had overseen this airport's transition from a mid-tier transport hub into a flagship of the region's future infrastructure plan, and yet she had just learned, on live television, that the most vital figure behind its funding had not only been mistreated under her watch, but humiliated in public by her own staff. Someone knocked once on the glass. A junior assistant whispered, "He's still downstairs." "The media's asking if you'll respond." Nancy didn't answer immediately. She only stared at the screen where Malcolm's name rotated alongside key investment data. Then she straightened her blazer, walked toward the elevator, and pressed the button without a word. Downstairs, reporters were already flanking Malcolm's departure path. He didn't linger. No smiles, no handshakes, just steady movement, flanked by Eleanor Grant and his legal affairs manager. As he passed the central atrium, another monitor lit up with a line from his speech. "What happened today reflects a system, not an incident." A collective hush fell across the hall, like air being pulled from a room. And then, cutting through the crowd, Nancy Cole appeared. She walked briskly, heels striking hard against the marble floor, her face composed but taut. Cameras swiveled, mics extended. The press assumed she would call for a pause, make a statement, offer a scripted apology. Instead, she walked directly to Malcolm, extended a hand, and said, loud enough for the microphones to catch, "Mr. Reed, I want to apologize." He stopped but didn't shake her hand. He only looked at her. The pause stretched long enough to silence every nearby voice. Malcolm regarded her with a calm that no longer needed diplomacy. He studied her, her posture, her expression, the words she chose. "I hope your apology outlives the headlines." He nodded once, turned away, and continued walking. Nancy lowered her hand. A reporter whispered into a hot mic. "That's the sound of power being exercised without permission." Malcolm exited through the side corridor, disappearing behind a wall of frosted glass, leaving the press frozen in place. And just like that, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just a mistreatment scandal. It was a story of unchecked authority meeting quiet ownership. The man they had doubted had just made everyone in the room question who really held the keys. Upstairs, within a private operations boardroom, crisis communications specialists convened under glaring fluorescent lights. The room was filled with executive-level panic, rapid emails, whispered strategy, and half-drafted apologies. But the larger concern was already unfixable. Footage from the press briefing was now clipped into hundreds of versions online, some reposted by verified political accounts, others by travel influencers, business analysts, and social justice advocates. A popular podcaster tweeted, "Imagine the richest man in the airport being treated like a threat. Now imagine he owns the terminal you just insulted him in." It racked up 100,000 retweets in under an hour. Nancy Cole returned from the terminal looking visibly drained, her voice steady but brittle. "We either admit institutional failure now, or we become the face of it." No one argued. Back at his firm's satellite office near Millennium Park, Malcolm sat in a quiet conference room surrounded by glass and city lights. Eleanor placed a tablet in front of him displaying the day's press coverage. He waved it away. "Let it run," he said. He didn't need to spin anything. The truth had moved faster than spin ever could. For years, he had operated in silence, investing, building, funding systems that were built to exclude men like him. Jake Ralston's employee badge was deactivated before sunrise. Kendra Myers received a suspension email mid-shift. Officer Dale Parker was pulled from his gate post by Internal Affairs before he could clock in. No ceremony, no soft landings. Their names had already been cited in dozens of complaints and at least 2 pending lawsuits that the legal department had quietly buried. Now, with their faces trending and their voices caught on tape, the airport issued a press release, effective immediately. Involved staff are under investigation and removed from duty pending review. The statement was cold, procedural, and far too late to matter. Within hours, investigative journalists descended. They didn't need long. Old internal memos were leaked, complaints flagged as unsubstantiated, bias training skipped, supervisor signatures rubber-stamped without reading. One file showed Kendra's name linked to a 2021 case in which a black veteran was removed from the lounge due to dress code, even though he wore a tailored blazer. Another lifted Officer Dale's involvement in a prior incident involving a Latino family asked to provide extra documentation at a domestic checkpoint. Each case had been quietly closed. Now they resurfaced with teeth. Headlines began stacking like Dinasic's flagship terminate, and airport under fire after an environment survey signaled BS. The city couldn't look away. Jake Ralston, caught off guard by the media blitz, tried to explain himself on a live stream he posted from his apartment. "I didn't mean anything racist," he said, blinking under the harsh light of his kitchen. "It's just that people sometimes push boundaries. It's not about color." But the comment section exploded. Viewers clipped his words and stacked them against his past behavior. One user dug up a photo from 2 years prior, Jake posing with a now disgraced officer who had been removed for discriminatory profiling. Another uploaded a video of Jake mimicking accents at a staff party. The algorithm fed on outrage, and Jake's name was no longer just part of the airport story, it became its emblem. By sunset, the airline's CEO had released a follow-up statement acknowledging a culture that allowed microaggressions to fester into structural failure. Meanwhile, Eleanor Grant coordinated RNC's next move. While Malcolm remained away from interviews, his silence now carried the weight of 1,000 voices. Public figures, celebrities, and activists aligned behind the story, not as saviors but as amplifiers. Civil rights lawyers praised his restraint, economists cited his discipline, and youth groups held up his image as proof that Malcolm didn't post. He didn't need to. Every video, every article, every news segment now ended with the same message. The system didn't just underestimate him, it exposed itself to him. He became a mirror they couldn't escape. "We're not accepting interviews at this time," she said. "Mr. Reed believes the story already speaks for itself." At the airport, panic metastasized into shame. Internal memos started circulating: mandatory, retraining, outside audits, zero-tolerance restructuring. Staffers who had long remained silent now stepped forward, filing statements about a culture of unwritten rules that allowed racial profiling to persist under the guise of customer service. One agent admitted being told by her manager to trust your gut when it came to high-risk travelers. Another detailed a pattern of selectively enforcing baggage policies based on surname. As the public called for firings, terminations swept through the departments. Kendra, already suspended, received a formal notice of termination. Dale's badge was revoked, Jake's name was stripped from all duty logs, and his access to internal systems was blocked. What began as an isolated act of humiliations had cracked open a fault line that ran through every inch of the terminal's operations. By Friday, local news crews no longer waited for press conferences. They stood permanently stationed outside the airport's administration building. Social media campaigns shifted from outrage to reform. Activist groups began pushing for policy reformations and new leadership. The airport board scheduled an emergency review, announcing that all hiring, training, and review protocols would now be under third-party oversight. A city councilman introduced a bill requiring annual public bias audits at all transportation hubs receiving public funds. Malcolm's name was mentioned during the hearing, not as a victim but as the catalyst for correction. This isn't about wealth. This is about the right to exist in public spaces without being questioned for your presence. The room erupted in applause. At the heart of it all, Malcolm remained unmoved, not distant, but focused. In his office, he reviewed the final language of a public infrastructure clause he had long pushed for, now finally adopted by the city. The clause required all contractors and affiliated agencies to submit annual equality impact reports, real ones, with enforceable metrics. Eleanor placed the signed packet before him. He reviewed, initialed each section, and signed his name without pause. Nearly a year had passed since the terminal's name made national headlines, not for a flight delay, but for the kind of moral failure infrastructure alone could never fix. Where there had once been whispers of disgrace and systemic failure, now stood a reformed hub built not only with reinforced steel and glass but with public transparency, lived accountability, and the lessons of its reckoning written into policy. At the main entrance, above the newly redesigned VIP wing, a quote engraved in brushed metal greeted every traveler who passed. "Respect is not earned by status, it is owed by principle." The city had changed the way it built and ran its airports, but the more surprising change came from within. Dale Parker, the security chief once responsible for initiating the silent removal of a man he deemed out of place, returned to the public spotlight not in defense but in humility. He had resigned 6 weeks after the incident, then reappeared months later, not to reclaim power but to seek understanding. Dale published an open letter titled, "I Was Wrong." It was printed in the Sunday editorial of the city's largest newspaper and reposted across platforms. He didn't minimize what he'd done, he named it. He wrote of the assumptions he had carried into that moment, the blind spots that shaped his idea of what suspicious looked like, and the way fear disguised itself as that we were protecting an old comfort one that made injustice feel polite. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, he requested permission to rebuild himself from the ground up. He enrolled in anti-bias training, attended panels on institutional racism, and volunteered with a program that retrained retired law enforcement officers for civic reconciliation. He never spoke Malcolm Reed's name in the letter, but its presence filled every line. It was the apology no one asked for, but one that changed something nonetheless. Ralston's transformation took longer, and no one expected it. He disappeared after his termination, his name a flashpoint for every article and video that documented the downfall of a culture that thrived on exclusion. For months, he lived offline, out of the frame. But healing often happens in silence. What began as bitterness turned into reflection. A friend convinced him to attend a seminar on privilege and public behavior. He didn't speak. He sat in the back. Then he came again. And again. What he once mocked, he now struggled to understand. His turning point came not from punishment, but from recognition. I was someone else's reason to feel unsafe. That was someone else's reason to feel unsafe. That was enough. A year later, he became a volunteer speaker for a racial justice nonprofit, traveling to service companies. His message was raw, imperfect, and honest. The fact that he once stood at the heart of the crisis gave his words the kind of gravity textbooks could never match. Malcolm Reed never sought revenge, and he never asked to become a symbol. After the incident, he declined every televised interview. He did not sue. He did not gloat. He returned to work, to building, to investing in systems that worked better than the ones designed to exclude him. The second phase of the terminal expansion moved forward, with a new clause added to every vendor and contractor agreement. mandatory reporting on equity impact, third-party ethics audits, and inclusive hiring benchmarks tied directly to continued funding. At one corner of the new East Concourse stood a quiet installation, a circular glass wall surrounding a listening room that played stories submitted anonymously by travelers from all backgrounds. Above the entrance, etched in steel, read, "Because silence should not be survival." Malcolm's name wasn't displayed there. That was intentional. He hadn't changed the system by shouting over it. He'd changed it by refusing to disappear. The city honored him privately. No stage, no speech. A signed resolution was sent to his office, acknowledging his leadership in turning confrontation into transformation. He didn't respond. But months later, at a conference on infrastructure ethics, he appeared unexpectedly in the audience. He stood when asked if he had any final words. He said only this: "We don't build cities with concrete, we build them with conscience. And if a system only works for you when no one different shows up, it was never working at all." The room stood still, then erupted in applause. But Malcolm was already on his way out before the clapping stopped. The end. If this story made you think, stay with us. Malcolm is no to come. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and which part of the story struck you the most? Was it the silent strength of Malcolm, the transformation of Jake, or the moment truth finally hit the system? If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and share this with someone who needs to see what justice really looks like when it walks, not shouts.